Hey guys, okay, so a little interesting thing sort of popped up here recently that kind of got me scratching my head. It was born from an issue as presented in the Epic forums on a rather unusual lighting effect on Genesis 8 figure. And since we were using Genesis 3, it seemed rather unusual because, well, basically we've never seen this kind of effect on as far as lighting goes. So behavior-wise, it's similar to smoothing group error, or it could be overstretching of the UV mapping, and of course this led into a whole in-depth conversation about GCMs and this and that, and quantization, skinning, and what have you, and a lot of red herrings, considering that we have never run into any great issues. So to kind of back things up a bit, a little bit of history is, Frozen Sand has been using Data Studio as a development tool since about 2010, and have committed to using Genesis 3 as our main framework for about the past 5 years. So, any issues or problems that have popped up, we have long resolved those as being issues as to usability particularly for our project. Now, not suggesting, of course, that this is a solution for everything as far as character development goes, but as to our needs, because we've been developing on that platform as a framework, as in, you get Unreal 4, you get nothing in it. So to be able to make use of it, the idea behind development is to take a base idea and expand upon it and make it usable as far as being repetitive, and ideally keeping everything within a single channel. In other words, everything that and anything that works from one character that we've designed flows through to one, to the other, to the other. Now, the nice thing about Data Studio is it's entirely built on the idea of a framework. In other words, Genesis is the framework for all the DAZ Studios or DAZ 3D's based Genesis or DAZ original character models. So if you purchase, for example, Victoria 7, it's based on the Genesis 3 framework. And that's the same thing with Victoria 8, is built on the Genesis 8 framework. So when we first started using it, there were some severe issues and problems. Now, to qualify the statement, a problem is simply something that can't be resolved. In other words, there's something fundamentally broken that has to be fixed, versus predictability or practical use, where there is a requirement to make the end result function in the way that you wish it to, function. So this is the idea behind a framework. So once again, what works with one works with the other, and then everything is about adding in the necessary requirements to make that work the way as you expected. So when you look at something like this, of course, you start running in different directions as to well, what's this problem? Is it skinning? Is it JMCs? Is it, or JCMs, I should say, or whatever? Now, JCMs is joint control morph, which is historically been around for ages, but they're called different things in different applications. So, if, for example, in 3ds Max, it's called a joint morph deformer, and the fact that Data Studio supports any kind of joint deformer like that, as in the same idea as to 3ds Max, is pretty rather impressive. And to kind of show off how this kind of works is the nature of skinning is two-directional. It needs assistance. It needs help to be able to move in a third dimension, which allows you to properly shape a joint as to maintaining volume. So, for example, the test requirement here is, as you can see, is with the arms up kind of indication here, you can see that we have something weird going on here, which is reflected in the problem that this particular person has. So it's in the source. So, but getting back to the joint deformer, the cool thing about it is that if we create the necessary angle, you can create a morph target that when this joint reaches a particular angle, it deforms properly based on the kind of shape that you want it to take as to correctness. Now, if we look down here, Genesis 8 includes the ability to turn off on and off the JCM, so you can actually see the compare the results. So here we have joint deformers activated. If we turn them off, you can see that we get this really weird shape now that's not defined. Like if you look at the back, we have the spread in the back here. We turn on the correction, you can see how everything is properly reshaping to what it's supposed to be. Now, this does not necessarily mean we have to export the JCMs out of Daz Studio into Unreal 4 to make that functionality be included in that. But in reality, it's just another morph shape. So it really can't impact or affect any kind of lighting solution once it's been activated. So that leads us to the question of what really is the problem. So here's our first hint: is in the female development load, we have some really unusual stuff going on here. So if we turn off the deformer, what happens to it? It's still mushed up. So just to kind of confirm, yes, there is a issue or a problem on the Genesis 8 side of things. Now, this kind of created kind of a fogginess because we don't use Genesis 8 because, well, when Genesis when Unreal 4 reached 4.15 and Genesis 3 was introduced, the two of them went together like peanut butter and chocolate. It worked as the functionality, as the purpose, as to not generating problems, but requirements of how once you've imported into Unreal 4 of what is required to put in necessary finishing touch. This is not a make it look good button kind of solution. You still have to do the work. But you know, the general thinking as to best practices is you should make stuff from scratch. We needed the framework, which of course we still make stuff from scratch based on our needs. So, but it fits within the logic of the framework that's presented from a tool like Daz Studio. So we don't run into these kind of problems because, well, when Genesis 8 came out, we just kind of looked at it and did some research and what have you. And Genesis 8 is more of a is to bring the product lines into alignment with the proper versioning numbers. So as I mentioned before, Genesis 3 is reflected in Victoria 7, which created a lot of confusion. So the idea behind 8 was to kind of streamline things back into a much more say product-wise type of conformity. So as well as to allow for greater backwards compatibility with the Genesis 3 products that are up for sale. Every time a new Genesis model came out, whatever was before it became rather redundant and of course was kind of lost in the pile. So you have all these really usable digital products that can't work with current frameworks. So Genesis 8, the idea behind Genesis 8 is simply to allow for greater backwards compatibility. They obviously added this base joint correction button where you can turn it on and off to see the effect, but it doesn't, it just kind of makes the in-app usability easier for the end user, to those using Daz Studio. Of course, the use in a video game is something that Daz 3D has been trending towards. So there's a lot of not hit and misses and so forth. So as far as Unreal 4 goes, Genesis 8 is, I would consider, a miss and has problems. It has issues that I would not recommend the use of this framework. If you have a desire or need to use procedural generated characters, I would recommend that you stick with Genesis 3 because it was made more for the Unreal 4 pipeline. It behaves as to expectations. So here's what I mean by that. Let's go ahead and move this over to one side, and I've been throwing on examples, proof of concept. Nothing proves anything better than the demo of the difference between the two of them. So this is why kind of scratching the head is that you would expect as to predictability that Genesis 8 would work in the same way as Genesis 3, but unfortunately it doesn't. It has these problems, and as I mentioned, the difference between a problem and a requirement is really a deal breaker, because you can't not solve this. Now, to try to work through this, I did do some sampling tests and different things and what have you, and here's the kind of my results that I come up with. Now, to set the parameters to it all, the cool thing about that makes us all work as part of the framework, of course, as I mentioned, is everything works within that single channel. So if we want to create multiple different characters, you can create the same number. You can create, as you see here, 3 different unique characters off of the one character. So in reality, we have really just one character model, and everything else is done through injectors and what have you. Now, injectors are a cool concept. They're also referred to as full body morphs, in that you take your base model. This lovely lady in front of us here is the base Genesis 3 model, and they're simply using injectors and using programs like ZBrush. Anybody who's used ZBrush, an expert in it, let's say, can make basically any character that they wish. So the total number of characters that we want, as far as NPCs and so forth, is infinite. It's just it's left up to your imagination, and of course it's by its very nature is considered either a derivative or in most cases as being original art. So everything and anything that you make in a 3D environment is a derivative of something anyways. You got to start with something, even if it's a cube. So in this case, the Genesis 3 has no more intrinsic value than a cube in its shape and form. It just has bipedal type of qualities to it that allow you to shape it. So the parameter here is to take a character, the Genesis 3 and the Genesis 8 character, directly out of Data Studio and bring it into Unreal 4 and compare the two as in relationship to one another. So we have a relative comparing apples to apples, not comparing apples to oranges, as to expectations. Once again, we're still dealing with requirements. So when we import it in here, of course we have zombie eyes, because that's one material issue that has yet to be resolved. But of course, now that we're 5 years in, we've obviously fixed this as a requirement, not as a problem. So everything works with, as to our design, works within that single framework. So this character here, as a female character, can be a zombie character, can be a little old lady model character, and of course all the resources and requirements that are true to this character are also true to this, which also includes things like morph targets and what have you. So without going into great detail, it's easy enough to just pop out whatever character you want, and then the morph targets, for example, for lip sync, not only works with this character accurately, but this one and this one too as well. So this makes that pipeline, that this takes the repetitiveness out of the design pathway. So you're not constantly reinventing the wheel when the same resources can easily work within that framework. So that's the important thing, and part of that is if we do just a quick type of test export here, and we do blah 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 blah, and we do an export, and we look at our export rules. Within the export rules, you can see final anything baked. So that means that any shape that we create within this viewport as to fidelity of asset is then exported out into Unreal 4 as being baked into the geometry. So any kind of shape, we have a high degree of consistency and the fidelity, and also in predictability too as well. So bring it in. I hope I'm not going too far off the track, but it does require explanation about why we've been so successful with this as compared to any kind of update that has come far down the pipe as to Genesis 3 frameworks. So now we look at these problems and we're saying, okay, well, why is this? Okay, so obviously the problem is we have a difference in the framework that's being used, Genesis 8 versus Genesis 3. So as to predictability, this is what I expect doing a one-to-one import into Unreal 4. From here, everything else becomes a requirement. So if we're looking at the character here as to anything that might be unusual, you can see some rather unusual shading as far as shadows goes, and it kind of looks like it's doing weird things and what have you, but in actuality all these characters are brought in using a single color map, which of course, when being inside a physics-based environment, the lighting solution, the lighting model that's being used, when it hits the character, it doesn't know what to do. It just says, well, there's not enough information as far as being a physics-based material to actually generate a rendered solution that as to expectations. So even though it looks a little bit, the shadow effects look a little bit strange, that has more to do with the fact that this is probably a really harsh type of environment, and but we've been working with it so long, we know what the requirement is as far as materials goes. We know the requirement as far as lighting goes. Tweaking the indirect lighting versus maybe putting a emissive self lighting onto it, which gets rid of all the shadow bleed, unbalanced shadows. It just it needs like a 0.001 emissive lighting effect onto it to kind of soften up the rude shadowing effects. The eyeballs, normally we just basically exclude those, and then we just use a geometry based common eyeball element that we've sort of hijacked off of the Paragon characters, and then just socket them in place. So the zombie eyes is pretty common. It's an easy fix. It's just one of those things that's hard until it becomes easy. Okay, so getting back onto what has inherently been kind of a red herring chase around our tail around the block as to the potential problem, it was to test out the probability that there is a problem with the whole conversation just basically gotten to the point where, hey, wait a minute, is this guy right? Is there an inherent problem? And as I mentioned, we just basically opted out not to use it because the Genesis 3 framework is far superior as to the purpose of video game development. For example, they follow a lot of the rules as far as power to materials. The geometry, the character geometry is actually less than the Epic-based character model. I think it's something like 42K or something like that. So the character here is actually 32K. So it's actually less than the Epic character. That we have tons of morph targets and a lot of development time done into this. We have the UV map on one character to the other is the same, so a lot of development time is involved here, and it just didn't make it worthwhile to actually switch to the Genesis 8. It really wasn't optional, considering that there's also joints in the 8 version that are not necessary. They're there strictly for allowing for backwards compatibility, and we don't need backwards compatibility. So setting this up as the parameter of, this is as ugly as it gets kind of idea. Everything else after this is a requirement, not a problem. So we're good to go, and we're just going to stick with this as to the end of times, unless as suggested by DAZ3D when we emailed them some information or a request. What we wanted to do was to fix and resolve all the problems and issues with the of using the Genesis 3 as the base. Like as I mentioned, back to my opinion that you fix problems through iteration. At some point, our player model that we're actually using in game, will reach a point where it's it's actually, maybe GCMs and this and that and the other thing where we have a really nice type of result that we'll be able to share. And they more or less told us, no, you can't do that. We were actually working on something that is actually Unreal 4 related, so maybe they'll resolve that in due course as to the current problem. As compared to what we have now, the only difference between this character and that character, of course, is body type. It's a little bit more shapely, but that doesn't mean we can't make this a little bit more shapely using injectors. But you can see we definitely have a problem here. Now, this is a problem because I've done a lot of little different things to try to resolve this. Over here, I basically stripped off the morph targets and the skinning solutions, and it's a little bit better, but you can still see this is the problematic area that has something involved that's going on with the base mesh. So it has a problem that I have not been able to fix. Same thing on this side. So it's inherited from DAZ Studio. It is not a problem in Unreal 4, as you can see. This is just basically a static model. I took off, as I mentioned, the skinning and morph targets and what have you. So it's not a GCM. It's causing it and what have you. It is in the geometry. So if we look at this character here, you can see the problem. Now, as I mentioned, a big deal about this pipeline is the ability to use injectors and more shaping and what have you. Now, because there's a lot to be said about this, but once again, there's not a problem here as to the requirement of making this all work out the way that we want it to. So you moving forward. You're not sitting there trying to figure out how to get rid of the splotchiness. And then to illustrate it even more, here's the here's the Genesis 8 with an injector, and which is just a simple bodybuilder type of target. So if we look at it, though, you can see that the splotchiness and what have you gets even worse. It looks like a smoothing group problem, but there's something damaged with the geometry, and now that happens. The only way to fix it is just once the geometry gets corrupt. They have a word for it. It's called bit rot. Once it becomes corrupt, then the only alternative really is to start from scratch. Okay, so hopefully I haven't gone on too long, but to confirm it, yeah, there is an issue, a serious issue, a problem with using the Genesis 8 characters in Unreal 4. It's not an issue with Unreal 4 because the same problem exists in like it's really bad over here. It exists in DAZ Studio. If we turn off that value, oh man, stop it. If we turn off the joint, you can see that it's still got some weird deformity in the mesh. It could be a skin weight problem. But to go back to a statement made earlier, I would recommend using Genesis 3 over Genesis 8 for us. It has a proven track record as to working correctly as to expectations without having to go a little bit sideways on it. I haven't seen anything in Genesis 8 except for me, that it is from in some sense a much more advanced character, procedural parametric character than the Genesis 3, but there's nothing that makes me want to say, well, because it's a bigger number, it's got to be a better version. So just kind of making this as a heads up that if you're thinking about just playing with it, I would recommend sticking with the Genesis. Excuse me, hiccups. I would suggest sticking with the Genesis 8 over the Genesis 3. Okay, see ya, bye.